coming to Nationwide Children since I was 11 years old, and today my primary doctors consist of Dr. Olszewski, hematologist, immunologist Dr. Peter Musillo, and rheumatologist Dr. Stacy Ardwin. And we hope that what we share with you today will be encouraging and highlight some of the things that we have found vital in a doctor-patient relationship. And you may wonder how my mother and I came to acquire the insights that we have. And before we dive into the meat of our talk, I'm going to give you a very brief synopsis of the beginning of my medical journey, because there's always a beginning to every journey, right? So when I was born, I looked like a preemie, weighing 4 pounds, 9 ounces, even though I was full term. Another unusual thing about me is that I had club feet and dislocated hips, despite being born through a C-section. My dad often liked to joke that it looked like I just should go back in the womb and bake a little bit longer. As I got a little bit older, I dealt with sinus infections, ear infections, bouts of pneumonia, and I was a severe asthmatic. One Saturday, I woke up, I was 6 years old, and I had excruciating pain in my knees. I was diagnosed with septic arthritis, and my parents took me to Cincinnati Children's. Once I was there, they confirmed the diagnosis of septic arthritis, but they also discovered that my blood counts were not where they were supposed to be. And I remember being taken from department to department, being tested for diseases like lupus, MS, leukemia, CF, and everything came back negative. I did not have any of those diseases. So many doctor's appointments and tests later, I was given the very broad diagnosis of combined immune deficiencies complicated with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, which basically meant that my specialists didn't know exactly what they were dealing with. So this mystery illness has given me a roller coaster of a ride in 31 years. Yes, I know it does not look like I'm 31, but I am. But it's brought a lot of pain, countless once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, and many lessons, which is exactly what we want to share with you today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to my mom, and I'm very blessed that I get to call her by that title.
We are happy to be here today, and I appreciate this opportunity. The first point Whitney and I want to dive into is the importance of advocacy. When Whitney was a child, the role of advocate fell largely on my shoulders. My husband, Whitney's dad, was a hands-on guy, involved in every aspect of Whitney's medical case, reading every doctor's report, being present at every surgery, serious procedures, and scary new treatments. But since he was the primary breadwinner, when it came to doctor's appointment and baseline interactions with doctors, I handled that. But even though that responsibility was mine, my husband and I were a united front and agreed as parents. It was imperative when it came to advocating for Whitney, we made sure her doctors cared and respected her. We listened to her specialist instructions, but also knew when it was time to lift the bubble and give her some normalcy, and realized that new steps, new visions, and faith were sometimes necessary. And this advocacy began even before we knew Whitney had a blood disorder. As Whitney stated before, as a toddler, she had many sinus infections, ear infections, and had already had 2 sets of tubes. At this time, she was seen by a world-renowned pediatric ENT. However, he didn't always have the best bedside manner. At this particular visit, when Whitney was about 3, this doctor discovered that she had an infection in her ear that needed to be removed. He didn't convey this to us, and he didn't ask if he could perform a procedure on Whitney. We were just taken to a procedure room, and when he came in, he didn't speak to either one of us. Instead, a nurse straddled Whitney, and he came at her with a long instrument that had a point on the end. As you can imagine, I was appalled with his lack of explanation, but I didn't want to say anything at that point because I would scare Whitney, and she had this instrument in her ear that could cause damage. During the whole visit, Whitney whimpered and trembled due to the scaring unknowns, but never once did she scream or cry out or throw a fit, and I was really proud of how she handled her fear at only 3. After the procedure, Whitney once again whimpered and trembled because of what she had just experienced. We were taken back to an examining room, and when the doctor came in the room to finish the appointment, he looked at Whitney and pointed his finger and had said, "You have whined and you have cried ever since you've been here." And he looked at the nurse and told her to get her out of there. Well, as you can imagine, this mama bear was really upset. A friend of the family had come with us that day to take care of my other daughter, and I asked her to take Whitney and Lindsay out to the waiting room, and the nurse led them out. When everyone had left the room, the ENT looked at me, and I must have had a distraught look on my face because he said, "You aren't very happy with me, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm not." I said, "You haven't spoken to us since we got here today. You explained nothing to us. You told us nothing about the treatment. You had a nurse straddle Whitney, and you came at her with a long pointed instrument. Even with all of that, Whitney never screamed or cried. She only whimpered and trembled. She was just 3, and of course she's going to show fear when someone treats her like that." He told me he was sorry, and I told him he also owed Whitney an apology. So he followed me out to the waiting room where Whitney was playing and knelt down beside her. Poor thing was afraid to even look at him. The closest thing he got to an apology was asking her if she was going to do anything special when we left the office that day. And once again, Whitney wouldn't look at him or answer him. I told her the doctor asked her a question and she needed to answer it. I wanted him to see that regardless of how he acted, I wanted Whitney to have respect and good manners. And though he never apologized to her, every appointment after that, he was kind enough to explain everything in depth and told us the treatment and never was rude or disrespectful to Whitney again. Thankfully, strained relationships with doctors like that one are few and far between. Mostly, we've had wonderful relationships with Whitney's specialists. One of the special doctor-patient relationships we developed was with Whitney's first rheumatologist at Cincinnati Children's, and his name was Dr. Murray Passo. He adored our daughter and treated her like a princess. He gave us the confidence and the security to discern when it was time to lift the bubble and let her have some normalcy. One of the symptoms of Whitney's disease was her severely enlarged spleen. There was always a risk that if it was bumped or knocked, that it could rupture. So organized sports were strictly forbidden, and that kind of always broke our heart because we felt Whitney probably would have been our little athlete. We tried to give her some semblance of quality of life while still having measures of precaution. My husband and the girls would occasionally play softball in our yard, and the neighbor kids were never allowed to join in. It would always just be my husband, Brent, our daughter, Lindsay, and Whitney. Well, on this particular day of playing ball, they were letting Lindsay bat one more time. What Lindsay didn't realize was how close Whitney was standing behind her, and when she swung back to hit the ball, the bat perfectly landed on Whitney's left side. We were all so upset, and Lindsay the most, because she was very protective of her sister. Britt and I knew with the impact that we would have to take her to the local ER. When we were taken back to a room and we explained Whitney's medical history, the doctor called her rheumatologist, Dr. Passo. They came up with a plan, and then Dr. Passo asked to speak to me. I braced myself because I knew that I was going to be scolded. I answered the phone and heard on the other end, "What in the world are you doing down there?" I apologized profusely, and I told him that it was just a freak accident and we had taken every precaution to prevent something like that from happening. But we believed Whitney needed quality of life and deserved to have times where she wasn't completely limited. The kind doctor might not have always understood why we continued to allow Whitney to be not completely confined, but we truly believed if we didn't allow her to try to surpass her limitations at a young age, she would grow up with no determination to try and may develop the mindset she only had purpose inside the medical world. I think you can clearly see our daughter has no trouble going after what she believes in and anything that she wants to accomplish. But I believe the most difficult thing about advocating for your child is when you have a wonderful doctor who cares for them and settled and secured, but you realize a step of faith or a new vision is necessary for your child's well-being. I want to say I never want it to appear that I'm bashing a doctor. I realized Whitney's case was difficult and no specialist always knew what they were dealing with or exactly how to treat it. With that said, my husband and I expected her doctors never to give up, continue monitoring her, and admit when they didn't know what was wrong, but promise to care for her by always trying to figure out how to help her. When a doctor isn't doing these things, then you know it's time to take that step of faith. When we began our journey at Cincinnati Children's, Dr. Passo was Whitney's rheumatologist until the rheumatoid issues subsided. And after that, it was apparent that her primary specialist needed to be a hematologist. So Dr. Passo took a step back. Every hematologist who saw Whitney couldn't figure out what was causing this mystery illness and what treatment would work. The only thing they knew to do was keep her system from crashing with high doses of steroids. But with the long-term effects steroids can have, my husband and I asked them to keep trying to look for something less evasive. The more unknown, the more frustrated the hematology team became. Finally, they found something they wanted to try, IVIG. It did seem to help, but a month later, the treatment went on national shortage and she was unable to receive it. Once again, the hematology team at Cincinnati could not agree on the direction of the care. So we were sent home, told to continue on steroids, and we'd be notified when they wanted to see us again. We went 8 months without any word from a hematologist, and Whitney remained on steroids unmonitored. As young parents immersed in a world we knew little about, we had no clue how to proceed. Well, was this normal? Was it appropriate for us to go over their heads and get a hold of Dr. Passo? The good Lord must have knew that we needed help, and he opened the doors for Dr. Passo to catch wind of our predicament. He was extremely upset, and he felt so strongly that Whitney had doctors that cared and valued her as a patient. Even though he wasn't a hematologist, he decided to become her primary doctor. Once again, Whitney had a doctor who was going to go above and beyond to care for her. He consulted doctors from many departments, held countless roundtable discussions with specialists to discuss her case, and even had a dry erase board with countless theories and hypotheses of what could be causing her illness. I mean, what can a parent ask for more? After about 2 years, Dr. Passo once again became Whitney's doctor. My husband's brother-in-law, who was a pharmaceutical rep, reached out to my husband and I. He lived in North Carolina, and one of his clients was the hematology department at Duke University. He developed a relationship with a hematologist named Dr. Zimmerman. He told her about Whitney's case, and she expressed an interest in seeing Whitney. We were so torn. Here we were receiving the absolute best care from Dr. Passo, but we knew the invitation could open doors to answers that we truly needed. We consulted Dr. Passo, and without hesitation, he said, "You need to go." At Duke University, we did see the hematologist, Dr. Zimmerman, and immunologist, Dr. Myers, and they were both wonderful, and they came to the same consensus. Whitney's primary specialist needed to be a hematologist. And since Duke wasn't a realistic option, hematology at Cincinnati wasn't willing to care for Whitney, then her care needed to be transferred here to Columbus Children's. And Dr. Zimmerman went on to explain there was actually a specific hematologist she wanted Whitney to see, and his name was Dr. Randall Olszewski. Sorry. He's here today. Remember, I'm a mom. And my husband and I, our heart knew that we had to make the right move, but our axis felt as if it was going to be shifted because we would be leaving a doctor we knew, we loved, and no doubt had our daughter's best interest at heart. But we knew for the sake of Whitney's future, we had to take that step of faith. I remember calling Dr. Passo that night from North Carolina after we celebrated Whitney's 11th birthday and explained what the doctors were recommending and that we were heartbroken, especially Whitney, to make this move knowing we would lose him. He just wasn't our daughter's doctor. He had become one of her favorite people. He told me that he was heartbroken as well, but we had to go. Whitney needed a hematologist, and it was time to leave. With that conversation, I remember feeling peacefully released. Yes, we were heartbroken, and Whitney was devastated, losing the security of an incredible doctor, but we could take the step forward knowing that we would have a new chapter with no regrets. Shortly, Whitney had her first appointment with Dr. Olszewski, and he's been her doctor ever since. And that grew to Dr. Mustillo and Dr. Ardwin, and this team of doctors have been absolutely wonderful, never giving up on her and always making sure she had the absolute best care. I know they are a major reason she is doing as well as she is today. Again, what could a parent ask for more? So as you can see, advocating for your child can be difficult. Balancing when it's time to stand up to a doctor to demand care and respect. Knowing when it's time to lighten your child's restrictions so that they can have some quality of life. And seeing when it's time to move forward with blind faith. I'll be the first to admit that advocating can be intimidating and overwhelming. But being the advocate for your child with an illness is so pivotal and necessary because it'll teach and allow them to grow into independent adults capable of being their own advocate and managing their own case.
So I'm going to discuss advocacy from a different angle because of the phase of life I'm in. First of all, let me share something really cool. Dr. Olszewski and I have had a patient-doctor relationship for 20 years, which is so amazing. When we came to our 10th year anniversary, I got him a card that said, to my forever from your always. And I reminded him last year that we were coming up on our 20th anniversary and I needed to get him a card again. To which he replied, no way. When you get to 20 years, you don't do a card, you do cake. So I'm holding him to that. He's back there, we're having cake, and hopefully it's before I get my Benadryl so I can actually enjoy it. But I do love that Benadryl, I gotta say. When I left Dr. Passo in Cincinnati Children's as an 11-year-old girl, I was not happy about it at all. My security in what I do was being stripped away from me. But soon after I met Dr. Olszewski, all my fears went away, and I felt that same stable security that I felt with my Cincinnati doctor. Dr. Olszewski and I, we quickly found our patient-doctor rhythm, and because we're both fluent in snarkiness and sarcasm, there's not an appointment that goes by that we do not try to outwit each other. About 3 years after Dr. Olszewski became my doctor, he added Dr. Musillo to my team, and 4 years after that, I transitioned from Dr. Higgins being my rheumatologist to Dr. Ardwin taking over my care. And I have developed a special relationship with them as well. So what I'm getting at is when you have a chronic illness that begins as a child and goes into adulthood, your pediatric specialists and nurses have watched you grow up right before their eyes, and they almost become like medical parent figures, so to speak. So therefore, cutting the cord of what they've always known and done for you can be as hard as it is for the patient's actual parents. And this can make the role of advocate transitioning from parent to adult patient be a little bit difficult for our pediatric specialists. After I finished college, I stepped up and began fully managing my case and advocating for myself, and my parents' role became support system. I had no worry or fear stepping into this role because I knew I could take the tools and the lessons that my parents instilled in me and make them my own as an independent adult. Did I still need my parents? Sure, every adult kid does. Did I still seek their advice? You bet. But the difference now was I was the team captain. I coordinated all my appointments. I called my doctors and discussed all my concerns, and I led the conversation in every doctor's appointment. Now, let me just say this. I completely understand that 95% of your patients are children. I mean, nationwide children's, duh, right? But you're so used to dealing with parents of patients, not adult patients. And just as you develop a relationship with us, you develop a relationship with our parents as well. And even though I understood this, I didn't count on my pediatric specialists having a difficult adjusting to this role reversal because they knew me. So one comical memory I have that caused me to begin to see this came from this book. This is my medical album. In it are 3x5 cards with my diagnoses, my medications, my allergies, surgeries, and every single one of my doctor's contact information. So when I was in an appointment and a doctor or nurse had a question, I could whip out that 3x5 card and hand it to them. Now, this I did derived from, give me a minute because it's super heavy, from my mom's 3-ring binder of notes, okay? So I mean every height measurement, every weight, every blood pressure, temperature, and extensive doctor's notes is in this 3-ring binder along with 7 other ones just like this. I mean the My Chart before the My Chart, right? So anyway, you know, it came in handy because you know when a doctor looked at her and said, hey mom, what was the antibiotic that we put her on like 3 years ago in the fall that gave her hives? My mom could whip out that 3-ring binder that was as big as her, I might add, and tell him the exact date, antibiotic, and regimen of that medicine. So when it came time for me to manage my case, I condensed this concept and only brought the essentials to my doctor's appointment, thus the medical album. And my mom was so impressed and proud, and it made me happy because deep down, every adult patient wants to make their parents proud. So I began carrying this medical album around to my appointments, and the response I would get was, oh, that's great. And then they would turn to my mom and say, "Did you come up with that for her, Mom?" And my mom would quickly give me the credit, telling them, no, it was all her. And they would look at me in surprise and say, "Oh, wow, good for you." And at first I was so honored that I came up with an idea so good they thought my mom came up with it. But then I slowly began noticing in doctor's appointments that when I was talking to my doctors, they would glance at my mom, almost making sure if I was giving them the correct details or if I was missing anything. And I didn't quite understand this because I was about 25 or 26 at the time, and I would explain to them, the reason my mom is still in here with me is because she's my support system and I'm hard of hearing, so she's helping me hear. And I would leave each appointment and I'd tell Mom, I need to be the one guiding these conversations and answering all the questions, and she completely understood. But when a doctor directly asked her a question, she felt she needed to answer it, and I understood that. But the moment I knew that I had to make some changes, when I was in an appointment and a nurse asked me how I had been between that current appointment and the last one, and the entire time I talked, she looked at my mom, not even looking at me. Now, the reason I am sharing this is because of how it made me feel, so you guys are aware of how it could be making your other, young adult patients feel that you still care for like me, and how I felt was incompetent. I didn't feel like they believed that I could handle my care without my mom, and I know none of my doctors or nurses ever intended to make me feel that way. But I think sometimes our specialists just focus on the physical, and they forget the emotional and the social issues our disease can bring as well. And for me, aside from my family encouraging me and cheering me on growing up, I had so many people in every area of my life who didn't understand how sick I was, or they believed because it was a disease they had never heard of, I was making it up. And any chance these people got, they would basically tell me I should do nothing but just exist. And as crazy as it sounds, my specialists inadvertently giving their attention to my mom stirred up those feelings of incompetence. So I had to make the difficult decision of asking my mom to remain out in the waiting room when I had an appointment with my doctor so I could become the lead and the facilitator. And at first, my doctors did not understand this at all. They would come in and the first question would be, "Where's your mom?" And I'd be like, "She's in the waiting room." And they would say, "Oh, well, you can go get her. Do you want to go get her?" And I'd be, "You know what? No, she's good. But if you want to say hi to her, we can go get her after this appointment's done." And they would give me the most comical look, and I felt a little bad because I liked that they liked my mom. But I knew this choice would be best in the long run, so my doctors could truly see that I'd grown from that sick child with an uncertain future into an independent adult with unlimited possibilities. And I'll never forget when I saw the benefits of that decision. During an appointment, my nurse practitioner met with me first, and she got all the information so she could give the synopsis to my doctor. And before she left, she asked me, "Is your mom with you?" And I said, "Yeah, she's in the waiting room." And so she said, "I'm going to go say hi to her." When we left, my mom said, "You'll never believe what your nurse asked me." Of course, curious, I said, "What was it?" And she said, "She asked me directly, why don't you come back to the appointments with Whitney anymore?" And Mom said she just gave her a look that conveyed everything. And it just clicked with that nurse. And she said, "Because she's an adult and she can handle it." And my mom smiled and said, "Exactly." And I remember feeling so relieved because the image I had so long wanted to convey had finally shined through. And on the flip side, another thing I did that a lot of my doctors knew, I did have some maturity and wisdom about myself when I came nationwide and serious decisions had to be made. Or I was taking my Rituxan and you get that hefty dose of Benadryl and reactions can happen. My mom's with me, or a relative, or a friend. I've always understood that a patient is going to need a support system no matter their age in some shape or form. I love my specialists, and I know I wouldn't receive the care anywhere else that I'm receiving now. And I have made them quite clear, Dr. Olszewski can vouch for this, they're never getting rid of me. But I can understand how difficult it is when the authority and advocate has transferred from the parent to the adult child that you have literally watched grow up before your eyes. And I'm sure it didn't cross your mind in med school that you might doctor a chronically ill person from childhood into their 30s because they are so complicated and rare. But I can't tell you the encouragement and confidence you instill in your adult patients when you look to them as capable of standing on their own 2 feet. It really causes them to shine even more. And at the end of the day, I think your wish echoes that of your adult patients' parents. You want to see them fly despite their disease.
Playing advocate can be difficult and intimidating, but that role is defined, and the next thing we would like to discuss is the importance of the doctor or nurse listening to a patient and the patient trusting the doctor's insight and expertise. And for me, this balancing act began when Whitney was 4 weeks old. As Whitney told you, when she was born, she had club feet and dislocated hips. Her feet were so severely clubbed that her ankles became the bottom of her feet. I was 29 years old, a young mom, and no one else in my life had ever dealt with any similar issues, so my husband and I could only go on what we knew, and that was taking Whitney to a local orthopedic doctor with no pediatric background. And that doctor's plan was to put Whitney in corrective casts at 6 months old. Being a teacher, I began my school year, and the subject of Whitney's club feet and dislocated hips came up in front of the school nurse. She was a little spitfire, and she was not afraid to give her medical opinion no matter how blunt it was. She spoke up and said, "Oh no, that's not going to do. Whitney's a baby, and babies need to be seen by pediatric experts, not a doctor who only sees adults. You're going to go up to the office right now, and you're going to call the orthopedic department at Children's in Columbus, and you're going to explain your daughter's situation, and you're going to tell them that you want to be seen by the head of the department." She marched me right upstairs to the office, stood beside me, so I said exactly what she told me to, and I called the orthopedic department at Children's and explained everything. And they asked me, "Can you come today?" I was shocked at the response, and I explained that I was a teacher in the middle of my school day and I couldn't leave, but my husband and I could bring Whitney the next day. And the very next day, we met the head of the orthopedic department, Dr. Torch. Whitney was put in corrective casts. This is one of her first little ones. That day, and it was 6 months sooner than the local doctor would have done it. Dr. Torch explained that by the time Whitney was 6 months old, she would have gone through substantial growth development, and waiting to begin the treatment would have been detrimental to correcting her club feet. And now looking at her, you would never know that she had that birth defect. Now obviously my school nurse had a very strong personality, and so it would have been difficult to go against her. But my husband and I could have decided it was easier to stay local because we were young parents. The casts were needing to be changed weekly. We were making a 4-hour round-trip drive every week, and it could get expensive. But thankfully, we did make the correct decision, and Whitney was spared from developing severe orthopedic issues that would have significantly diminished her quality of life. So I can't stress enough how important it is for a patient or a parent of a sick child to stop and truly listen to what their doctor is saying. And as a physician or a nurse, you know when your gut is telling you the choices your patient or their parents are making is not the right course of action, just as my school nurse did. So do whatever you can to make them understand the urgency of the situation, because it could cause severe consequences for them in the future. But sometimes there's a flip side to this, when there's a time for a doctor to listen to the patient or the parent of the patient. And when this time comes, the doctor needs to lay aside their expertise and sometimes their arrogance and convey to the parents that they are truly taking their concerns to heart. Whitney mentioned that her disease manifested itself through a bout of septic arthritis, but didn't go into all the details of how we got to Cincinnati Children's. But the beginning of Whitney's medical journey was as complicated as every other aspect of her case. That Saturday morning, my husband began waking up our daughters, who were 6 and 8 at the time. When Whitney woke up, she looked at her dad and said, "I can't move my legs." He takes off the covers to reveal that her knees were twice their size, looked as if they had been burnt, and felt like fire to touch. My husband called for me to come into the room, and for the next couple of hours, we tried everything to get her out of bed. The least little movement caused her to let out blood-curdling screams, and Whitney had always had a very high pain tolerance. We racked our brains as to what could be happening. We knew the day before she had been on her great-grandpa's farm and wondered if she was having an allergic reaction to something from the farm, or maybe she had a tick. We just didn't know what to think. She was eventually able to walk with a severe limp or awkwardly crawl because of the pain. Later that evening, she spiked a temperature of 105, and we knew something was seriously wrong. We rushed her to our local ER and were blessed to see a pediatric doctor who had just happened to be at our local hospital at the time. She diagnosed Whitney with septic arthritis and wanted to admit her. This seemed serious, and we felt she needed to be seen at a children's hospital. We didn't want anyone else to miss something with her. So the doctor agreed as long as we took her to Cincinnati Children's the next day. She explained that we should call her pediatrician and let him know what was happening, and he would help us get to the correct department. I called her pediatrician's office. The nurse put me on hold to speak to the doctor, and then she came back to tell me that he wasn't concerned and just allow the septic arthritis to run its course. I was baffled. I had an ER doctor telling me it was serious, and I had her pediatrician telling me it was no big deal, and I didn't know what to do. The only thing I did know, something was wrong, and I wasn't going to stop until I received clear direction. So I mustered whatever boldness I had, and I called the ER and asked to speak to the doctor who had seen Whitney the day before. Thankfully, they put me through, and I explained that Whitney's pediatrician didn't think there was any reason to be concerned, and it was not necessary to go to Children's. The ER doctor was confused how Whitney's pediatrician wasn't concerned that Whitney was septic, but she was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, and she told me to call him back and say that on top of having septic arthritis, her SED rate was also in the 60s. He would know what that inflammation marker meant, and he would see the seriousness of the situation. After hearing that, he would definitely make the right decision. So I called the pediatrician's office again, and this time I could hear in the background the nurse explaining everything to the doctor. When she got to the part where she revealed the level of Whitney's SED rate, I actually heard him let out an arrogant, belittling chuckle. You see, you can tell her that I see kids all the time with SED rates that high, and it's no big deal. Tell her to stop worrying, and Whitney will be okay. I was confused, I was angry, and torn on what to do. I couldn't get Whitney's pediatrician to stop and listen to understand the gravity of the situation, and I didn't know if it was appropriate to call the ER doctor back, not knowing how I would be received. Ultimately, I knew that Whitney's health and well-being was more important than any intimidation or awkwardness I felt. So once again, I called the local ER and asked to speak to the doctor. I spoke to her and shared with how Whitney's pediatrician had acted, and she was noticeably upset. His actions were unbelievable to her. So she told me not to worry, she would handle everything, and the next day, we headed to Cincinnati Children's and met Whitney's rheumatologist, Dr. Passo, who bent over backwards for Whitney until we transitioned here to Nationwide. So unfortunately, there will always be those uncomfortable times when the parent's gut is right and they must stand up to the doctor, insisting that their voice be heard on behalf of their child, because every child with an illness deserves every inch of full life that can be given to them. But in my experience, the most difficult give and take between a doctor and a parent who is raising a child with a disease is when the child's situation becomes so dire they are in no state of mind to think through what is needed for their child, and the doctor must step up and take lead and direction of what needs to happen next. The beginning of 2011, Whitney began losing excessive amount of weight, and certain foods gave her severe stomach pain. We weren't sure what was causing it, but in August of 2011, Whitney was diagnosed with a maltation of the small bowel, and due to the havoc it was causing on her body, it had to be surgically fixed. If you're a doctor or a nurse of Whitney's and have interacted with her, then you know when there's a challenge that Whitney's passionate about, she's not afraid to tackle it. Well, Whitney was getting ready to begin her senior year of college. She had accepted a leadership position as hall chaplain at her dorm, and she wasn't about to give it up so easily. Her disease had caused her to give up so much in her life, and it wasn't going to take this too. So my ambitious daughter came up with a plan to combine her 2 final weeks of fall semester together. So what was supposed to be the week of final projects, she added in all of her finals also. She came home to have her surgery during the finals week, and that way she could have 3 weeks to recover from her surgery instead of just 2, and then go back with all the other students to finish her senior year as if she hadn't had major surgery. I had to hand it to her. Despite increasingly getting worse throughout the semester leading to the surgery, she finished up well, leaving with almost a 4.0. I remember my husband, myself, and Whitney's sister going to pick her up from school to bring her home for her 26th surgery. She looked pale, thin, and sickly. It was as if I was only seeing half of who my daughter used to be. This surgery was different than Whitney's other surgeries. Not only were they going to repair the bowel, but she was going to have a colonoscopy and an endoscopy also. So for 2 days before the surgery, she had a strict soft diet and then eventually a liquid diet. Then after the surgery, she came out with an NG tube that pumped her stomach until the bowels began making the sounds again. So Whitney went about a week without eating solid food. Before the surgery, she was already not retaining enough nutrients. So this took another toll on her body, going from 95 pounds to 75 pounds. But with the problem being fixed, Whitney's body would be able to begin healing, or so we thought. Once they began hearing the bowel sounds come from Whitney's stomach, they began the process of sending her home and checked her labs. Her hemoglobin came back in the low 9s. I don't know what was going through my mind, but normally I would have asked them to keep her one more night, check her hemoglobin in the morning, especially since it was Sunday, and it would be difficult to reach anyone if she became worse. But for whatever reason, I was in a fog, and I agreed with the nurse that it was just due to the trauma of the surgery. So, from the moment we brought Whitney home, we watched her body just slowly go downhill in 24 hours. She didn't have the energy to walk from the couch to the bathroom. Her skin went from normal tone to completely yellow. The reds in her gums and eyes went to white. But what the telltale sign was to us the very next evening, on Monday, she began throwing up. My husband and I loaded her up into the car and brought her here to Children's at the ER. Unfortunately, this night the ER was slammed, and we didn't get her back into a room until about midnight. It took the nurses about 3 tries for them to hit a vein. Blood counts were drawn, and we saw 2 hematology interns. Her hemoglobin came back, and to our surprise, it was in the high 8s. What we didn't know at the time was her hemoglobin was a false high because she was severely dehydrated. We were given the bombshell that hematology unit was slammed and Whitney would be taken back to the surgery floor and wouldn't be moved to hematology until late Tuesday night. Once again, I was in a fog, not even asking how would Whitney be cared for on a floor which wasn't in tune with watching for the signs of a hemolytic crisis. But again, I didn't question anything, I just went along with what I was told. When we went to the surgery floor Tuesday morning, aside from seeing a nurse when we first got there, we were put in a room at the end of the hall and hardly saw anyone. All day Tuesday, we watched Whitney deteriorate. Her complexion went from yellow to stark white. Every time Whitney had to go to the bathroom, Brent had to carry her because of the excruciating pain in her head was too unbearable, and her urine had turned dark brown. The only ability she had the strength to do was to stare. Again, my husband and I's minds were numb. The pain at watching our daughter's life drain out of her right before our eyes seemed to make us incapable of making any decisions. And usually in the past, I would have been on top of things, going to the nurse's station to get some answers, but mentally, I couldn't function. I think God knew how helpless Britt and I were. So he sent someone who knew exactly what to do, and that was Dr. Olszewski. He was on his way home from work, but he wanted to check on Whitney before he left. As Whitney stated before, usually when she saw him, she couldn't resist giving him a hard time, but all she could do was stare right through him. I've never seen him look so grave or hopeless as he was that night. He explained that he wasn't the doctor on call that night, but he had been kept in the loop on the treatment plan for Whitney. He explained that Whitney would be transferred to the HEMOC floor as soon as a room became available. He also explained because her hemoglobin was in the high 8s, they weren't planning to recheck it until the next morning, but that wouldn't do. And when we were finally to make it to hematology unit that night, we should ask for it to be checked immediately. The last thing he said before he left us was, if she makes it, we're going to have to talk about a bone marrow transplant. After he left, my husband looked at me and said, "Did you hear what he said?" He said, "If she makes it." Does he think she's not going to make it? We were devastated, but determined to do what he had directed. Our daughter's life was at stake. We were insistent that Whitney be moved to the HEMOC floor, and she was. Our heart began to bloom with a little bit of hope that things would turn around when we saw a nurse who had been one of Whitney's nurses for years in the clinic, and that night she happened to be on the floor. We told her that we wanted her hemoglobin checked immediately, and she said she would make that happen. And an hour after she told us this, the hope that we thought would bloom began to wilt again. Her nurse tried to get her up to weigh her to see the volume of Rituxan she would need to get, and she couldn't get her out of bed before Whitney would get sick. The stuff that came out of her was coal black, and as the nurse and I began to clean her up, the real nightmare began. Whitney would go in and out of lucidity. There were times when she didn't know my husband and I, and other times all she was capable of doing was staring, completely locked within her body. Every blood draw they tried to get from her would clot before they could get it to the lab. They eventually had to raise her bed as high as it would go, dangle her arm over the side, and start squeezing from the top of her arm down to her fingertip to get a drop of blood. Nothing they did worked, and they eventually had to call for the nurse from the ER who got Whitney's labs, her vein, the night before. She finally got it. They ran the blood sample to the lab in hopes of getting it there before it clotted. At this point, Britt and I had not showered in 72 hours, and looking back, I have no idea why that was important, but decided that I would go get a quick shower. We knew Whitney was critical, but we had no idea how critical, and we had no idea what was about to happen. Her lab's results came back, and the next thing I knew, Brent was banging on the bathroom door telling me I needed to get to Whitney's room right away, that her hemoglobin was 3.2. I rushed into Whitney's room with the other 8 to 10 nurses and doctors in there as the 2 hematology interns we had seen in the night before came running from the lab to Whitney's room with the grave news that her hemoglobin wasn't actually 3.2, but it was 2.8. My world felt as if it just shattered. What are we going to do about getting her blood? I questioned them. Those precious hematology interns replied with amazing news that they had went ahead and ordered Whitney's blood the night before, but just in case she would need it. I could have cried right there. You see, Whitney is never transfused with the hemoglobin that's in the 8s because she has so many antibodies in previous transfusions, and she's very difficult to match. It takes hours to match her sometimes, and that night we didn't have hours. The ICU attending made the call that Whitney needed to be in the ICU, and about midnight they walked us to the unit. They explained to us that they were going to give Whitney her Rituxan as well as transfuse her and give her an antibiotic that would probably turn her body red from the top of her head to her toes. They told us that our daughter was hanging on by a thread, and it was imperative she didn't react to any of the treatments they were about to give her. What Brent and I knew was that every time Whitney had a transfusion or Rituxan, she had a reaction. So how was our daughter going to survive? Once again, our hope was dashed away. My husband and I were directed to the ICU waiting room so that the doctors and nurses could hook her up to the monitors and the machines. When we walked into the waiting room, we thought it was a little strange because it was empty, except for one man sitting at the computer. It was midnight, there were a 3-person limit to each room, and ICU is maxed out to capacity. So why wasn't there more people in the waiting room that night? Regardless, our mind was on one thing, and that was to call our friends and family and ask them to begin praying for Whitney. The first person I called was one of my friends, and I broke. Brent took the phone from me, and the man from the computer got up and came over and stood before me. I met his eyes, and the first things I noticed, he had the clearest, bluest eyes I'd ever seen. "What's the child's name?" he said. I told him Whitney. He said, "Okay, I'll put her on the prayer chain." He didn't say my church's prayer chain, or he didn't say I'll let my pastor know. He said the prayer chain. Then he turned around and walked out the waiting room, and we never saw him again. He wasn't in the hallway or in another patient's room, and the other night that Whitney was in ICU, the waiting room was completely full. My husband and I believed that we had just entertained an angel unaware because the minute he left, Whitney had not one reaction to any of the medicine given to her. We saw miracle after miracle, and Whitney did a complete 180. So we took Whitney to the hospital on Monday. She was rushed to ICU on Tuesday night, went back to a regular room on Thursday morning, and we took her home on Saturday, which was December the 24th, 2011. The best Christmas present ever. 2 weeks later, she went back to school to finish her college degree as if the last 2 weeks had never happened. But if Dr. Olszewski hadn't come to the surgery floor Tuesday night, saw what kind of state we were in, and took charge, encouraging us what to do, I have no doubt we would have been burying our daughter that week. And look at where she is today. A beautiful, strong woman, the healthiest she's ever been, and seizing every opportunity that comes her way. And it brings this mama a lot of joy. So with all of that being said, I'll end the point by saying this. The relationship between a doctor and a patient, or a parent of a patient, can be difficult to figure out at times. But it's definitely a balance of a patient listening to their doctor's wisdom and insight, but knowing when to trust their gut and to voice this to their doctor. In turn, the doctor needs to understand that their patient or their patient's parents have been through trauma and sometimes just can't think through rationally and what needs to be done. Therefore, they need to step in and take the reins. Once this balance is achieved on both ends, a relationship between a doctor and a patient can be one of the most rewarding and impactful relationships.
How do you follow that?